About to see up here. So I've got 20 minutes, and I'm going to waste just a really brief period of that telling you that 20 minutes isn't enough time to give you everything that you need to know here. And I want to refer you to a few things that have happened previously and other sources of information. There was a forum that our organization held about this proposed development earlier in the summer, and there are some very nice write-ups about that in the West Seattle blog that you can read, of course. We have information on the DESC website, desc.org, specifically about our proposals for this project, and we have also hosted a visit of a group of about 8 or so Delridge neighbors to a couple of our facilities, and there are some nice write-ups about that on the Delridge Community Forum website. So I have the difficult task of trying to summarize for you what we're proposing to do, but also to help you understand why we're proposing to do it, and to do that in a very short period of time. So I'm going to do my best, but I think I just want to apologize in advance for missing some aspect of this that you may be most interested in. We've received quite a few questions, both in person from different folks and over the phone and via emails and blog comments and so forth, and it's difficult to assemble all those together and address it all in this short period. That worked. Except I went too far. Could you hit the up button on that computer there? Yes, thank you. Just real briefly, not to bore you with a history lesson here, but I want to narrow the focus of the term homelessness as it relates to what we're proposing here in this project in the DESC. There are multiple subpopulations of homeless people, as I'm sure you're aware. We do not attempt to help all of those subpopulations. We're focused pretty tightly and exclusively on a subpopulation known as chronically homeless individuals, and I'm going to talk a lot more about them here shortly. But the current crisis of mass homelessness in the United States is a somewhat recent phenomenon, mostly over the last 30 years or so. There have been much lower levels of homelessness throughout our history prior to the period in the late 1970s and mostly in the 1980s when it began. And that means that we have had this period of time to learn how to address these kinds of problems. We've also learned to identify the different subpopulations of homeless people in that period of time. And we're still learning, but it's in recent years that we've really landed on what we believe is a far more effective way of dealing with the homelessness of the individuals that we serve, the individuals who are chronically homeless. That is a relatively small subset of the homeless population. It's a relatively small subset of the homeless adult population. Most people who enter homelessness exit homelessness in a relatively short period of time with relatively small amounts of assistance provided to them. Some people get stuck in it. Those people tend to be folks who have more severe problems in their lives, and those people are the ones for whom the intervention that we call supportive housing is designed to serve. So, just a little bit more about DESC. We are an organization that started out by providing emergency shelter. We still provide emergency shelter to people. We have 3 shelters. The largest one is in Pioneer Square. It serves over 200 people a night, and it's open 24 hours a day. When the DESC shelter was created in 1979, the folks who started it up saw a crisis on the streets that they wanted to address, and their belief was that as long as we can bring people in and keep them safe, they will end up being able to resolve their own homelessness. They'll find a place to live and they'll move on. That didn't turn out really to be the case for a major portion of the people that we ended up serving at DESC. So there's still a need for shelter as a nightly survival mechanism, but the fact is that shelter doesn't do anything to resolve the homelessness of any one individual who's experiencing it. Another thing that DESC does is provide what we refer to sometimes as clinical services. These are behavioral healthcare services, providing mental health, psychiatric care, and substance abuse treatment for the homeless individuals that we see. We're actually a fairly large licensed mental health and substance abuse treatment provider. We have somewhere in the neighborhood of 1,600 people enrolled in those services. There's an array of services. Some of them are somewhat conventional community mental health services delivered on an outpatient basis, but we also do street outreach services, trying to engage homeless mentally ill people into services, engage them into relationships so we can get them housed and into safer places. It's very difficult to make much headway with a homeless mentally ill person when that person remains homeless. Providing them with those kinds of services helps them in their lives, but is hampered mightily by the fact that they don't have a stable place to be. This brings us to supportive housing and what it is. I'm going to talk quite a bit more about it, but the first point I want to make about it is that it's housing. And it's not a program, and what we mean by that is that it's not something people sign up for in order to get fixed. The folks that we're seeing who are chronically homeless are individuals who have been on the streets for long periods of time and have experienced virtually every conceivable kind of helping program that might be available to them, and for whatever reason it didn't take for these particular individuals. So we're not trying to create yet another program for them to sign up for in order to get fixed. We're trying to resolve their homelessness and do it in a way that's effective. So this being housing, I want to make the point that residents have leases, they have responsibilities in those leases, of course, which includes paying rent. But as any other tenant, they come and go as they please. The key thing, what makes it supportive, is that there are services provided to them on site in the housing that allow them to remain in the housing, that allow them to be successful there. Currently, we have about 800 units of supportive housing in our portfolio. Around 650 of them are in the 8 buildings that you see pictured here. In the upper right-hand, that just sort of general picture of Seattle is meant to reflect that we also do scattered site housing where we lease apartments throughout the community in small batches and place some of our clients in those apartments. But the bulk of what we do are these supportive housing buildings. These are apartment buildings that we own and operate, and which is what we're proposing here for the Delridge neighborhood as well. Our model of supportive housing is reserved for people who seem to have the greatest needs. So all of our units are reserved specifically for people who are homeless. Generally that means chronically homeless, homeless for a long period of time, and people who are assessed as being most vulnerable. We actually have a tool that we use, sort of a psychometric type tool, where we do an assessment of an individual's conditions and level of functioning, and we determine a vulnerability rating for the individual, and then we focus our housing resources on the people who have the greatest vulnerabilities as determined by that method. What that generally means is that the folks that we're providing housing to are people who have lots of problems in their lives, the most prevalent being serious mental illness. Substance abuse problems are also fairly prevalent. Poor credit, no credit, poor rental history, no rental history. Criminal history is a fact for approximately half of the people that we serve. The vast majority of that is in the form of very low-level status offenses and property crimes like trespassing, lower rates of felony crimes than exist among the housed population who gets arrested. and a history of not making it in other kinds of settings. People being evicted from other kinds of housing, non-supportive housing, and people being evicted, or maybe it would be better stated, not succeeding in conventional programs, treatment programs, or what have you. The model of supportive housing that we operate has a more specific term, which is housing first. And what that refers to is that we are immediately trying to resolve the homelessness status of an individual and then provide them with the services that they need to stabilize in their lives. That is sort of turning around a much more conventional approach, which has been the dominant approach in homelessness services over this span of 30 plus years I was mentioning before. Most of that time, the prevailing view was that we need to fix people, we need to make people ready to move into housing before we give them housing, because if they're not ready for it, they won't succeed in it. We don't share that view any longer, and the prevailing view of federal and local efforts to deal with chronic homelessness has also changed its mind on that view. There are far too many failures in that more conventional approach, and instead we have been one of the leaders in this field in pioneering this approach of housing first, and that has become a policy statement in efforts to end homelessness all around the country since. One thing that perhaps is useful in thinking about supportive housing as a different concept is that we're providing services on site to people in order to accommodate the disabilities that they have to allow them to succeed in housing. And an analogy to that would be people with mobility problems who are able to make use of their housing or other public facilities by virtue of things like wheelchair ramps, people who need assistance in the bathroom and so grab bars are installed. That makes them able to live independently in their settings, and the services in supportive housing are just another version of that. Instead of people having mobility problems so much, although of course some do in our programs, people instead have problems of how they function on a day-to-day basis, and they need the kinds of services you see listed here in order to be successful tenants, to retain their housing essentially. So what we do is we staff our buildings 24 hours a day. We don't have any live-in staff, but we have staff who are awake and on duty 24 hours a day to be available to residents. We provide both informal and formal types of counseling. We provide case management services to help people manage their day-to-day affairs. We help people manage their money in some cases. We help people manage their medicine in some cases. We provide meals to some extent to make sure that people actually get their nutrition needs met. As I was saying earlier, this housing first concept has become something that has taken on a lot of policy favor in ending homelessness efforts around the country, and that's because there is strong evidence in support of it as an approach. People are more successful through this approach. They retain housing longer. They get into housing in the first place because they're not being screened out due to these sort of housing readiness standards. And once they're in housing, they have a much better shot at getting connected to the kinds of services that they really need to make better use of the life and participate in the life of the community. There are quite a few research studies, including several that we have participated in, that show tremendous outcomes in terms of individual health improvements of folks who are receiving this kind of housing intervention, of interrupting successfully their long periods of homelessness, and also other benefits to the communities of getting people off the streets and keeping them off the streets, interrupting some of that sort of uncivil type of setting that you observe when so many people are out on the streets. And in some people's minds, one of the most important aspects of it is that it's a lot less expensive for societies overall, because individuals who are out on the street end up using a lot of public resources at high levels. Things like going to emergency departments repeatedly, going to other kinds of crisis services, including jail. The general model for our housing is that we have a staff that works at the housing project, and it's a team of people fulfilling several different roles. Each project has a full-time project manager who's responsible for the day-to-day operations and the service delivery there. There is a group of staff we refer to as residential counselors. We have enough of them that we can always have at least 2 people on duty at all times, 24/7. Some periods of the day we might have more than that, but generally there are 2 people on, including at night. Sometimes that number is overkill. We don't need that many staff, but if there's a personal crisis that a resident has, and which can happen at any time, then it's quite useful to have that level of staffing. Another group of staff we have are called clinical support specialists. Some people would refer to these kinds of folks as case managers. These are the staff who are charged with finding a way to work individually with the residents that we serve. Residents are not required to participate in services or work on any specific aspects of their care, but our staff are required to find a way into their lives and help them craft plans that are going to help them stabilize and grow. We also have a centralized maintenance and janitorial program at DESC that is responsible for keeping places clean and looking nice. Some safety issues that come up from time to time and the questions that we receive are worth mentioning here. Our buildings are designed in a way that there's a single entrance, which is secured. The residents all have key card access to a building, but their visitors do not. We have a reception desk, usually somewhere near the front door, that's staffed 24 hours a day by the group of staff I mentioned before. We have rules around visitation. Residents are allowed to have visitors, but there are restrictions on it. There are restrictions on the number of visitors. Typically it's 2, no more than 2 at a time. And there are limitations on the hours that visitors can be present in the building. We do have various security features built into our properties, including cameras in corridors so we can observe different kinds of activities more readily, and cameras around the exterior of the buildings. Our staff do regular walkthroughs through inside and outside the buildings, and are available at all times for any kind of emergency response that may be needed. When we use the term community, we mean a couple of different things. One of those is community of the residents inside the building. We try to foster that as much as we can. Some of that is through things like meals. Other things include different recreational or therapeutic activities on site in our buildings. Our residents are people who tend to have had lives that are very isolated from other people. They tend not to have had the kinds of experience of a lot of close personal relationships with other people, and we're trying to help them develop that. Community also means experience in the broader community, of course, the neighborhood that they live in, the city in which they live as well. And we foster that by facilitating outings in the community, going to parks, taking groups of our residents, different kinds of places where they can experience some of the joys and amenities of the community. We have some other things that we do to make sure that we as an organization are being good neighbors and participating in the community and the betterment of the community. And that includes that we have our project manager of each of our buildings join the local community or neighborhood council and participate in their regular meetings. We do have rules for our residents about behaviors in the neighborhood. For the vast majority of our residents, those are really moot because they weren't going to be a problem in the first place, but some of our residents who may have poor decision-making capacities benefit by having some rules that are explained to them and enforced with them, including things like not being allowed to panhandle in the community or beg for money, drinking in public is prohibited, any of those kinds of things. The vast majority of which may have existed when these individuals were homeless goes away once they're housed anyway. We also make it very clear to our neighbors that our staff are available and accessible to them to intervene in any problem that the neighbor thinks might be related to our operation in some way or another. So we provide our phone number, and it's answered 24 hours a day. And we will make our staff available to go out and observe something that is being reported to us. Sometimes in our existing programs, we've received phone calls where a neighbor says, "I think one of your people is over here, you know, on the sidewalk doing something they shouldn't do," and our staff will go out and make an intervention in that situation. The majority of the time that has occurred, and these calls aren't that frequent, but the majority of the time that has occurred in our other projects, the person has not been one of our residents, has been somebody who the neighbor thought appeared to possibly be one. But even in those cases, we have capacity, our staff have usually a skill set that allows them to assess the situation, possibly intervene directly, otherwise do something else to try to resolve the situation, which might involve calling 911 and dealing with the follow-up with the police. If it is one of our residents, then we would escort them home as quickly as possible, and then we would follow up with rule enforcement with them about degrading the quality of life in the neighborhood. I want to show you a handful of photos just to give a little more picture of what things look like. This is a group of our residents who participated in a community beautification project in Pioneer Square. One time, we try to sign up for those things when we can. This is a picture of one of the apartments. All the apartments in our buildings are studio apartments. They're fully self-contained units, so they have a locking door, they have a full kitchen, full bathroom in them, all the basic amenities somebody would need, but they're pretty small. We do furnish them with basic set of furniture, and we supply our folks with linens and pots and pans and that kind of thing because they don't have that stuff when they move in. Some photos of some of our newer buildings. This is a building that's just a stone's throw from the Seattle University campus on First Hill. I have two photos of our Rainier House project. It's in between Columbia City and Hillman City on Rainier Avenue. It's a 4-story building, which is the same height as our proposed building for Delridge. Another photo of the Rainier House building looking north. This is our most recent building, which opened a little more than a year ago. It's in the Cascade neighborhood. It's a 6-story building, but it does have this L shape, and so it's maybe a little difficult to see, but behind that car there's a fairly large courtyard there that makes for a very nice seating area for residents and in fact some other neighbors as well. I don't have more slides beyond this one, and that's just meant to offer an opportunity to talk briefly about what it is we're proposing to do here. We're looking to build a building, much like those other ones you just saw, that would provide 75 units, 75 apartments for the same population I was describing before. The building would be 4 stories and would be L-shaped with an opening in the front that's related to tree preservation, actually. And somebody asked about the timeline for this. We're fairly early in the development process for this project, but we're trying to acquire capital financing now. And if everything goes as smoothly as possible, we would be looking to get under construction of a building about a year from now or so, or sometime next fall anyway. And then the building would open approximately a year, a little longer than a year after that. So we'd be looking at fall, probably late fall of 2013 for completion of the building and opening of it. And that's all I had prepared, and I think I went slightly over my 20 minutes, but that's best I could do. Sorry. Thanks.
You are forgiven. Thank you. That's a lot to digest. If you would just take a second and write down either on one of the Post-its or the tabletop what's in your heart right now. I don't want you to lose the questions that you have for DESC before our next speakers stop talking.
Thank you, Daniel. We gave Daniel a list probably of 2.5 pages of questions and asked him to speak to those in 20 minutes, so I appreciate your effort there. Our next speaker is Rick Huber. He is the Director of the Office of Housing with the City of Seattle. And we have 2 brief speakers who we've also limited to a very small amount of time, speak from the City of Seattle. And the reason is we would like to give you a sense of who at the city can help us with this issue, can talk to us about certain aspects of this project that we would like addressed. And I would like to make a couple of announcements. One is that we have another guest here from King County. It is Cheryl Markham, and she is the Program Manager of King County's Housing and Community Development Program. Cheryl, could you stand, please? Right there. There are a number of ways that DESC is funded. They're funded at the local level, the county and the city, also the state, and also some federal dollars. So we have the county and the city funders here with us today. And because the city Office of Housing contributes more to the policy that contributes to the housing here in Seattle, that's why we're having Rick speak and not Cheryl, but we don't want to limit her importance to the issue, and appreciate her being here. One final guest I'd like to introduce in the back of the room, Captain Paulson, is the captain of the Southwest Precinct here that covers Delridge. Appreciate him being here. And then one last announcement, please sign in to the sign-in sheet at your table. If you've already done so, don't sign in again. You are welcome to sign up to be on this distribution list for emails about DESC, or also for our email distribution list for our community organization here in North Delridge. And I'll turn it over to Rick. Thank you very much for being here.
Thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here tonight in Delridge to help provide information and answer questions. I'm going to speak fairly quickly here and just throw out answers to a couple of questions that Kirsten provided that I thought that you would be particularly interested in. And then I want to help get to the question and answer period as rapidly as possible so that we can spend most of our time answering your specific questions. The Office of Housing has been involved in the Delridge neighborhood for a very long time. We've been helping to address housing issues. We've worked with DNDA on 7 of their projects, helping to provide funding. We provided assistance to Brandon Court project on Delridge and Brandon Street. Vivian McLean project next door we provided assistance to. Model project citywide that was able to provide a branch library with rental housing upstairs. I'm here tonight in part to because DESC has applied for funding from the Office of Housing to help construct this project. Funding applications were due to the Office of Housing the end of July, and we will be making funding decisions in about a month. Frequently, a question comes up about, so who makes the funding decision? And it is established policy by mayor and city council that the Office of Housing Director, myself, makes final funding decisions. So that's how that process will work. That process includes addressing two very important policy issues that, again, the mayor and city council have felt strongly over the years are ones that we need to take very seriously, and we do. And they are, first of all, the neighborhood notification and community relations policy, and secondly, our siting policy. And both of these policies are contained in the city's consolidated plan, a document that's located on the Office of Housing website. I actually have about 5 or 6 copies of the housing policies section that contains both of these policies in great detail if anybody is interested. And what I wanted to do at this point in time is to just describe very briefly how those two policies apply to this particular project. The notification policy is on page E12 of the housing policies section, and it's a policy that has been in place many years and has helped us through a number of controversies as we fund projects. It's based on the belief that neighbors have a very important and serious right to understand projects that are being proposed in their neighborhoods, to ask questions, to get together in meetings like this with project proponents, sponsors, to find out what's being proposed, to find out the time frame, to engage, determine how the neighborhood wants to engage with the project sponsor over time to maintain a connection to the project. These are important projects to neighborhoods, and the city feels very strongly that these kinds of meetings are very important to the process, and we are delighted that so many people came tonight. And we do not consider this to be the end of the process by any means. When we look at the kinds of meetings that sponsors have planned, the kind of process that they plan to go through, we essentially want that process to begin prior to when applications come to us for funding, like this one has. We don't expect that the process would be completed by the time we make funding decisions, because we've learned in many other neighborhoods that these processes, to work well, often take several years perhaps to carry out, and to make sure that all the people who are interested in finding out about the project do know about the project, and that there is help that the neighbors often can provide sponsors as these types of projects open in neighborhoods. So we are delighted that this process has begun. And again, I'll say more about that if people have questions in a little bit. We also believe that these processes, while we have certain particular things that we like to see happen, meetings like this, notices mailed within 500 feet of the project site, we also think that these projects are unique, neighborhoods are unique, and we don't prescribe too much in these notification processes, because we like to come to meetings like this and have you engage and have you help us understand better how you think the notification should continue and how you think you'd like to remain engaged in the project development over time. The other policy that applies is our siting policy, and essentially it says that in any block group in the city, and the city is divided into census tracts and subdivided further into block groups. Block groups contain maybe 500 to 1,000 people. In this particular block group, no more than 20% of the housing should be set up, funded, provided for extremely low-income people, and that means people with incomes generally between $18,000 and $25,000 a year. The City Council has felt for some time that these types of projects should be limited in number to no more than 20%, There is a possibility of a waiver and criteria for waivers to that. In this case, we did provide a certification letter, it's called, acknowledging the siting policy, and we felt that this project is consistent with the siting policy, and I signed that letter last July. So those are the two policies. And the final thing that I'll mention real fast is that we're particularly interested in getting feedback from you tonight. It's our responsibility for administering the review process of these projects. We want to make sure that you have adequate opportunity to work with DESC, and we need to know what would you like to see happen after tonight. We'll have a great opportunity, I think, for questions and answers, but to the extent that you think some neighbors may not have had all of their questions asked or answered yet, or you haven't, and there needs to be follow-up steps or next steps, we're very anxious to find out from you what you think that should be. So with that, I'll pass the microphone to Diane, and I'm happy to be here tonight as long as you still have questions.
Thanks, Rick, and thank you all for inviting me. When we were asked to write down a word or two on the table at the beginning, I had to write down 3, and I wrote down, "This meeting impressive." I'd just like to commend all of you for having this type of a meeting to try to understand what is being proposed and work through the process with us. I was given a few questions, and I'll go through them very quickly. You also have a sheet on your table that says Department of Planning and Development facts. And so a lot of what I'm going to be mentioning is on that sheet. And on the back side at the bottom are 2 links to some information in terms of our website, where you can go to follow this particular project once they apply, and where you can find out about public information, public comment, how best to get involved, those kinds of things. So quickly, some of the questions that I was asked about the zoning and the height. The zoning is what we call NC 240, neighborhood commercial 2, which means it's kind of a medium to small kind of neighborhood commercial zoning. 40-foot height, and a 40-foot height zone also allows, not by variance, but just straight out by the code, an additional 5 feet if you do a pitched roof on your structure, and you also can get an additional 4 feet if you do the first level at least 13 feet tall. And what that means is you get a much better ground street space. So if a restaurant or a store or something were to go in, it's much better to have at least a 13-foot ceiling rather than just a 10-foot like a house. So it makes for a much more usable, marketable space. In terms of process, this project will go through both a design review process and an environmental review process. And all along the way, you are invited to send us comments. You can also attend the design review meetings. They're public meetings before a public board. There's opportunity to comment at those meetings, and as I said, also to comment afterwards. There would be at least 2 design review meetings. One we call early design guidance, where they talk about the basic concept, the massing, and what's being considered, and then at least 1 after they actually apply for their master use permit. We would then, they need to do what's called a SEPA checklist, SEPA State Environmental Policy Act, so they need to divulge what they believe would be anticipated impacts and potential mitigation. After we go through that review process, take in your comments, we would then publish a decision. The decision would be on our SEPA determination, and it would be a decision on the master use permit. And then you have an opportunity to appeal that decision if you so choose. And I mentioned those links on the back of our sheet. That talks about how you can become involved and where your comments are most appropriate. Another question was regarding that this project, which is a residential service project, would be taking up commercial space. It is an allowed use in a commercial zone, but there are limitations on the street level facade. So it doesn't mean the entire street level, but the street level facade is a maximum of 20% residential, or at least 80% non-residential, and that's to help the activity on the street. And so what would count as not residential would be retail, office, institutional, service kind of uses. There's a kind of a wide range of activities that could go into that street level facade. And then the last question was, about changing zoning in your neighborhood. If you felt that the current zoning is not consistent with your neighborhood plan. There are several ways to request zoning, and I've got to remember to talk about vesting too. Several ways to request a zoning change. One is an individual property owner can come in and request a zoning change, and it goes through a process through the hearing examiner, through the council before it would be approved. There's also, and that would be asking for one of the zones that exists in the code. There's also something that's called a contract rezone, and that is done a little more specifically to a project, for a site and for a specific project. And so there might be some conditions that are applied as a part of that contract, so that if the community said, we want, what's an example? We want an open space on this corner, there's certain leeway in terms of what we can ask for in a contract rezone. The third way is what we call a legislative rezone. That is where the city does a process. It's often related to a neighborhood planning process or something like that, where the city does the rezone. The private property owner does not have to pay, and it does go through a council process as well. At this time, we're primarily doing urban centers, urban villages, station areas, rapid ride corridors. Those are kind of the priorities for the city right now. The one thing about a rezone is a project that comes in and applies right now would be vested to the current zoning. So that even if the zoning changes later, the project would vest to the zoning that's in place at the time. So there's a timing issue that I want to explain there. And the other thing that I should mention is I mentioned where you can have comment and where we appreciate hearing from you. You know your neighborhood better than we do, so it's very helpful to hear your comments. I also need to mention, though, if it is a use that is allowed in the zone and it meets the development standards, we do need to issue that permit. We can take your comments, and it could help in things like mitigation and some of those kinds of things. But if it's a use that's allowed and developed to standards, it then needs to be permitted. I think I'll stop there.
Very great. Very, very great. Could you do one favor for me, though?
Sure.
Could you help me understand what vesting means?
Vesting, I'm not sure if I can say it straight. It means what code applies to a particular project. So if I apply for a project today, I follow the code that is adopted and in effect today. If the zoning changes tomorrow, that does not affect my project, but it would affect the projects that come in from tomorrow on. Does that help? Yes, thank you for asking.